Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on the topic of underrated cube cards, Inadvisable Omissions from the Magic Online Vintage Cube. Today I'm discussing 20 cards which aren't in the Magic Online Vintage Cube and which are, in my view, classic, elegant, and stimulating. My aim with this channel is to promote Magic the Gathering as a gentleman's game. Of course, it never has been a gentleman's game, and it is currently further from being one than it ever has been. But, with the possible exception of Dan Dan, I view Cube as the format with the most potential to be a gentleman's game. So, if you are looking to add a touch of class to your cube, consider cutting a few inelegant chase mythics from recent years to make room for these. I've divided the cards I'm discussing today into four groups. The first section is the shortest one, containing titans that I view as underrated. The first of the two titans I'm discussing in this section is Sun Titan, which is my personal favorite of them. It requires a deck to support it, but in such a deck it can be more powerful than any of the others. If the drafter wants to make Sun Titan good, they should be able to, since most cubes have a plethora of valuable cheap permanents. The capacity for unlimited potential synergies, such as with cloning effects, makes Sun Titan more interesting than its black counterpart in my view. Whereas Grave Titan can only ever give you 2/2 zombies, the permanent you return with Sun Titan could be anything. It could even be a 2/2 zombie. Frost Titan is widely regarded as the weakest of the Titans because it is. However, it is still a powerful and iconic creature in blue that offers interaction with any of your opponent's permanents. Its triggered ability can be used as mana denial when necessary, which is important for reasons I'll get to in the next section. Furthermore, if your opponent has a Titan, Frost Titan stops them from using its attack trigger, making it the best against the other four. Lastly, Ward 2 is by far the most powerful keyword ability among the Titans. Of course, Primeval Titan is an extremely fun build-around, and the raw power of Grave Titan needs no introduction, but they are aptly appreciated, so I did not discuss them. Inferno Titan also isn't in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, but I didn't discuss it here because its abilities aren't as interesting as those of its white or blue counterparts. But its raw power makes it worthy of a spot in your cube nevertheless. I recommend all 5 Titans and possibly Uro, but if you find Uro, Grave, or Inferno Titan to be too boring, it's justifiable to cut them. Still, I think any cube can be improved by the addition of the blue, white, and green Titans. The second group of cards I want to discuss are those that offer symmetrical resource denial. Of course, many contemporary Magic the Gathering players view lands and other sources of mana as ineligible for interaction. I attribute this to such players being entitled man-children who can't build a proper mana curve. But if you have any other ideas why they might think this way, I'm all ears. However, mana disruption is essential to the health of any high-power format such as Cube, and I hope to cultivate an audience that understands this fact. The reason why it's so important for an high-power cube to have ample mana disruption comes from the intersection between the abundance of extremely powerful top-end and optimized land bases that usually include fetches, shocks, duels, and triumphs. These facts, combined with the abundance of best-ever mana acceleration, lead to multicolored ramp decks being some of the most powerful and easiest to draft decks in Cube. If interaction with mana is off limits, the only way to win is to have a better top end than your opponent, which I find to be unbalanced and uninteresting. This is the same reason why Wasteland and Rishadenport are vital to the health of Legacy, to prevent unchecked greed from flourishing. Symmetrical sources of mana denial are the best case because, in addition to punishing overly greedy opponents who play too many colors, or whose mana curves start at 5, they force the deck builder to play an honest mana curve, since they will need to live without all of their mana as well. The first card in this section is Tanglewire, which also happens to be the coolest and best designed card in the game's history. At its best, it renders your opponent unable to cast spells for 2 turns if they only have 3 or 4 mana sources when you cast it. Meanwhile, you will still have access to two extra lands because you can have the fading ability resolve before its other triggered ability on your upkeep, and then tap it as one of the permanents you're tapping. This card was in the Magic Online Vintage Cube for a long time, but because it doesn't make treasure tokens, new players didn't understand why it was good and didn't bother taking or playing it, so they cut it. Raid's Cabal Minion is the Magus of the stack. It has a few key differences from Smokestack that make it a better card. The first is that, while it won't ever cause more than one permanent to be lost in a turn, it doesn't have to wait for a counter to get going, so it will start working on your opponent's board immediately after you cast it and pass. Furthermore, as a creature that causes both players' resources to dwindle, it will often find itself able to attack even though it's only a 2/2. While creature removal is more common, this does provide an inevitability that Smokestack lacks. Since you'll be playing it on your turn, your opponent will always have to sacrifice the first permanent, so you will be one trigger ahead on their turns. Of course, I also think you should include Smokestack in your queue, but it isn't one of the cards I'm discussing today. Mana Barbs is an unusual source of mana denial in that it doesn't at all reduce the mana that players have. However, it does add an extra cost to casting expensive spells that may make it better not to cast them even when you can. In the absence of life gain, it creates a hard limit on the total amount of mana that can be spent in a game. On the whole, it's an exceptional finisher that is guaranteed to lead to some very interesting game states. Opposition is interesting in that it would be a more powerful card if it were in any color besides blue, since blue is usually the worst at building a wide board. That being said, its power level makes it necessary to be balanced in this way. If you have more creatures than they have lands, they cannot cast spells during their main phase. Of course, if they have already deployed some threats, tapping your creatures to tap their lands renders you vulnerable to attacks. The third section of this presentation discusses cards from the set Conspiracy that allow players to take special actions during the draft. Since the cube is always drafted and cards should only be evaluated from that perspective, these cards are perfect inclusions in any cube. Of course, there are many other cards like these in Conspiracy and in its sequel, but the ones presented here are my favorites. Have you ever had a pack that had multiple cards that were great for your deck and wished you could take all of them? Thanks to Agent of Acquisitions, you now can. It allows you to take all of the cards from a pack at some point after you take it. The cost is that you won't be able to take any more cards afterwards until the next pack. It's also a playable creature if your artifact deck is short a card and has nothing better. Essentially, Cogwork Librarian allows you to defer your pick until a later pack if there's nothing that you want in this one. What's more, since it goes back into the pack after you use it, odds are that another player will take it and use it at some other point in the draft, making it a repeatable source of draft interaction. A friend of mine lets everyone start with a Cogwork Librarian when drafting his cube, which makes for a very fun experience. Aether Searcher is unique among these cards in that it's intended to be played in your deck. It allows you to cast a single off-color card without having to pay mana for it, though you still have to put it into your deck. This makes it especially good in Reanimator decks, since if the card you named is a creature that you want to reanimate, this serves as another copy of it that comes with an extra 6/4 creature. Canal Dredger is at its best in Cube because, whereas in most formats, last picks are usually unplayable, every card in Cube is good in some deck, so even if no one else wants a card, you might. With the exception of Aether Searcher, Deal Broker is the most playable of the Cube cards in this section. Since looters are in such high demand for Reanimator decks, Deal Broker will usually make the cut even if its rate is subpar. Its draft ability incentivizes speculatively picking cards from other colors, since even if you don't end up playing them, you can trade them for something you do want. Last in this section we have Lore Seeker. This is perhaps the most interesting of all because its ability is open to interpretation by the cube maker. Of course, you could add a sealed pack that you purchase from a set, but you could also add another pack from the cube. Most interestingly, however, is the ability to add packs from other cubes that you've made or ones from which your playgroup is willing to share. The last section is the section with no name. These are cards that are interesting and elegant, that are omitted from the Magic Online Vintage Cube, but that don't otherwise have anything in common with each other. First, in Section 4, we have Shrapnel Blast. Now, Burn is often the most streamlined of any cube archetype, with the exception of Storm, of course. So, adding cards like Shrapnel Blast or Galvanic Blast will mean that there's a subgenre within Burn decks that makes the archetype more interesting. Mimic Bat is a great card if you have lots of creatures with effects when they enter. Seeing as creatures with abilities triggered by entering are the most common way that players guarantee 2-for-1s, I'm sure that it will find a use. The sheer variety of cards that synergize with Mimic Bat means that you can always be sure it will lead to a memorable game or two over the course of your cube. Everything I said about Mimic Vat is even more true about Birthing Pod. It's my favorite build-around card in the game and gives otherwise bland mid-range decks a more unique identity. The elegance of Goblin Cratermaker lies in its flexibility. While not the most efficient, it is an on-rate creature that can serve as an answer to other small creatures or to Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. Vengevine and other creatures like it are the optimal solutions to the problem of Reanimator decks being too insular. Since it always has value in the graveyard, there will be more uses for Buried Alive and Entombed than just as setup for reanimation. If I did a binary approval poll about every Magic card ever, with an option to opt out, if you haven't heard of a card, I expect that Grey Merchant of Asphodel may be the single most beloved card in all of Magic. It's perfectly fair, but it's great at what it does. Vidalcan Shackles may seem like a mind control, but there's much more to it. Its main advantages are that it can be used repeatedly and at instant speed. While you can only control one thing at a time, you can use it again if your old target dies. For instance, suppose your opponent attacks you with vigilance creatures. You could take one of them, block the other, trading them, and then untap and still have the ability to take something else after killing 2 creatures for free. Boros Reckoner is an iconic card for mid-range or aggressive decks. Its ability will make decisions about attacking, blocking, and assigning damage less clear-cut. Also, its hybrid mana cost means that it can be played in a variety of different decks that have red or white. If you have any other ideas for underrated cards that I didn't discuss here, please leave a comment. Otherwise, Tinglewire enjoyers, please have a good day.